Hello, everyone. This is your right geek and honorary man king here with number one Marmaduke fan to talk about C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. This is the third in our series on the Cosmic Trilogy / Ransom Trilogy / Space Trilogy, although it's not really space as we've established in previous streams.
It's the heavens.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the heavens, not space. Yes. Welcome, Marmaduke fan. How are you?
Doing all right today. Look, this is by far one of the weirdest books I've ever read, and it's about twice as long as the first two put together. So we'll probably have a lot of meat to dig into.
One little administrative note: I am currently under a storm watch. So if the right geek should disappear from the stream at any time, that's because my satellite has gone out. Right now, everything's all quiet on the front, but just in case, I just want to put that little note at the beginning. And hopefully that won't happen.
Rain, go away, come again some other day.
Rain and hail and wind and lightning, please don't come in the middle of our stream. So I think we're going to do this stream like we've done the others, just chapter by chapter, doing the overview and talking about the things that we learn in each chapter. Now, as Marmaduke's fan says, this is the longest book of the three, so it's got a lot of material in it. But we're going to try to get through as much of it as we can, starting with chapter 1.
Could I say something real quick about the preface?
Sure.
So just a couple little things about the preface is Lewis makes mention that the fictional story of That Hideous Strength is connected in theme to the abolition of man. And if you read the two of them together, you can actually see how some of the visual story images in That Hideous Strength are connected to a abstract problem Lewis is worried about in English culture and academia. And so the phrase that sticks in my mind is the men without chests, where the men without chests in Abolition of Man are intellectuals who have no moral grounding or no moral root. So the joke is the only reason their heads look so big is because their chests have shriveled up and they have no heart. So if Abolition of Man is talking about that as a serious real world problem, we literally have evil societies creating living heads without chests in That Hideous Strength. And then maybe the other interesting thing for Tolkien fans is that Lewis mentions the unpublished manuscripts of Tolkien's Middle Earth writings in the preface, and thanks Tolkien for sharing those with him. So there's, in a way, this was kind of like a sequel to Lord of the Rings before Tolkien published a lot of his work.
Yeah. Yes, we have mentions of Numenor, and I think that it is also the case that he edited the manuscript when he encountered someone's writing on King Arthur to add more Arthurian legend to it as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard that Tolkien was not the biggest fan of Arthurian legend because Arthurian legend was too modern for Tolkien. He liked really ancient stuff.
Yeah. He was interested in Beowulf and the Edda and stuff like that. So earlier, Okay, so so we have this connection to the Abolition of Man, which, if you are interested in C.S. Lewis, that is an essential work for you to read. You get, and I think it's not only is it essential for understanding C.S. Lewis and how he thinks, but I think it's also essential even today. I think it's relevant today, to this day, the discussion of English education and what kind of people are being formed by that education and by that philosophy. I think that people today will recognize some of the themes in that book. And yes, so in the Abolition of Man, we have discussing intellectuals who have no heart and are leading only with their heads. And That Hideous Strength, we actually have disembodied heads that are supposed to be in charge, right? So there's definitely a strong connection between those two books.
You believe this book starts with a little debate about whether to sell college property at a tiny college, and by the end, it's oh gosh.
but it starts off in a very mundane way. And C.S. Lewis almost apologizes for it. He's like, oh, I'm going to start with something boring, but believe me, it's going to go somewhere else, right? So it starts with...
It's a fairy tale. Fairy tales are actually start with ordinary things and then move on to extraordinary things. And his point is to the people who lived back then, the castles and the cottages would seem as ordinary as a little college would seem to us today.
Right. So, C.S. Lewis basically starts his story in a place that he knows personally as an academic, with academics debating whether to sell a piece of college property. And what are some of the things that we learn in chapter 1? Well, we get introduced to Mark Studdock, right? Who the impression I get is that he is an academic that is somewhat mediocre, but he has learned how to go along to get along, and therefore he becomes popular with the inner circle.
Yep, the progressive element.
With the quote-unquote progressive element, right. We learn in chapter 1, for example, from Curry that Mark Studdock got his position at the college because someone basically put in a good word for him. They say here on chapter 17 in my copy, Denison was your chief rival. Between ourselves, a good many people liked his papers better than yours. So he is not as accomplished as Denison. However, it was Dick who insisted all through that you were the sort of man we really wanted. He went around to Dukes and ferreted out all about you. He took the line that the one thing to consider is the type of man we need, and be damned to paper qualifications. And I must say he turned out to be right. So Mark is not the most qualified academic for the job, but he is the most politically correct professor for such a job, right?
Something to mention is that Jane and Mark are unhappily married, and they have contrasting problems where Jane desperately wants to be seen. She wants to be an individual. She wants to be seen as a serious, smart, grown-up person. She wants to dress herself so that she is kind of like austere and looks serious. And she doesn't like the idea of anyone interfering with her life. And so she has resentment to Mark because Mark is involved in her life now. Mark, on the other hand, desperately wants to belong to something. So he almost is trying to run away from individuality and find a place of belonging in some group ever since he was a child. And the progressive element has become the closest thing he feels he has to a space where he belongs in an inner circle. And both of these two are going to push the extremes.
When we get to later chapters, we're going to see him reflecting on how his desire to belong and be a part of some group is, in fact, the dominant theme of his life. And he reflects upon how that has warped his life in a particular way. So we have, in chapter 1, we're debating whether we're going to sell the college property, right? And the quote-unquote progressive element, they are the ones in favor of this, right? And the ones who are the traditionalists, the ones that are on the outs, are very much opposed, but they are not listened to, right? And
I think it's also noteworthy that Devine, who has become Lord Feverstone, he's clearly become part of the House of Lords or something. And other members of the progressive element, they use, what would you call it? They use advanced political tactics on their opponent.
Yes.
So they set it up that, oh, well, we don't want to fence in that property, do we? No, of course. I'd never want to see that property fenced in. And we want to fund the poor little, novice professors, right? We want to make sure they have a little pay increase, right? Okay, now let's talk about selling the wood, right? So, and it's important that this wood has almost like spiritual significance to this college. It's a big part of the reason of why they're there and their history. And so, memorably, one of the conservatives, Jules, I think, stands up, and he's a really little old man and tries to give a defense of it. And either Featherstone or Curry, I think it's Featherstone, just shuts him down brutally, right? Like disrespects him in front of the entire staff. So there's also a noteworthy element where not only do they use these kind of tactics on their opponents, but the progressive element amongst each other are constantly jockeying for a higher position. So they'll make sarcastic comments about each other's intelligence, or sarcastic comments about this or that. And anyone outside the progressive element is an idiot, of course, and it just isn't with it. But anyone inside the progressive element isn't as with it as I am. So what Mark is quickly finding out is within the in-group, there's a smaller in-group. And as soon as he gets into the first in-group, he wants to then get into the second, even smaller in-group. So he's starting to, he used to respect Curry. Now Curry looks like the dummy, and now Featherstone looks like the really serious and knowing fellow. Right.
So we get sort of this establishment of Mark Studdock's and Jane Studdock's status quo, right? And we show in the way that Mark behaves that his desire is to be in with whoever is the most popular, whoever is the most powerful, and that is his flaw. That's going to lead him deeper and deeper into more and more immoral things. All right, so chapter 2, Dinner with the Subwarden. What would you like to say about this chapter, Martin?
I believe it's in this chapter where Jane goes shopping. And again, one of Lewis's strengths as a writer is, I think, when he has a theme, he makes sure to build it consistently. So she meets, she sees Mr. and Mrs. Dimble, and Jane thinks of Mrs. Dimble that, well, Mrs. Dimble's the sort of lady who fusses too much about having a pretty hat. Now, of course, Jane fusses about her clothes and the kind of hats she wears, but she likes to think, well, I'm smarter about it. I'm not silly like those other women. When Mrs. Dimble or Mother Dimble presses her a bit about how she's feeling, again, Jane desperately wants to be seen as a serious grown-up, but then she finally breaks down crying and admits, I've been feeling lonely and depressed, and she's been having dreams that scare her, and it's almost like a little kid thing where these night terrors are haunting her a bit.
Right.
If you read the book the second time, these dreams become extremely important foreshadowings of the evil things going on behind the scenes. So as far as Jane knows, or the reader knows, these are just strange, mysterious visions she's having. But after you reread it, you realize you'll pick up that she's had a vision of Dr. Frost removing the head of Alakazam as part of one of their experiments. And I think it's implied that Frost becomes aware of Jane's presence within the dream through his own psychic, what you call psychic power. And that's what alerts the evil society at Bilbury that Jane is having these visions and peeking in on their dirty doings. So it's recommended to Jane by Mr. and Mrs. Dimble that she could see Grace Ironwood about it. Now, Jane, of course, thinks, I must be going crazy. And something that strikes her during the conversation is they're actually not as worried about Jane being crazy as they're worried about what she tells them about her dream. Also of note is that Mr. Dimble Professor Dimble is an expert on Arthurian legend. And so he kind of has a casual conversation about Arthur and makes the point that Merlin is a bizarre character because he's a Christian and he works for Arthur, but he's also a druid and he uses magic power. How does Merlin fit into this world of it would be England versus Britain? The English are noble; they're kind of like the descendants of the French Normans, and the Britons are ancient, druidic, mysterious, and living in the deep woods. No connection to the Roman culture.
Right. Now, what my notes seem to focus on here in chapter 2 is more what's going on with Mark, right? So we have, I have quotes pulled from, let's see. Yes, by Joseph Feverstone, and No himself told me this morning that the sanitation of the Institute was going to be something quite out of the ordinary. So it is, said Busby sturdily. I don't see why one should think that unimportant. And what do you think about it, Suddock? Said Feverstone. I think, said Mark, that James touched on the most important point when he said that it would have its own legal staff and its own police. I don't give a fig for pragmatometers and sanitation deluxe. The real thing is that this time we're going to get science applied to social problems and backed by the whole force of the state, just as war has been backed by the whole force of the state in the past. So I believe I highlighted this because it displays the desire of the evil faction, right, to want to use science to control society and to engineer society in the way that they prefer, right? And yeah, I have a bunch of highlights in this section.
When they talk about their view of science, it highlights sort of like the mechanistic, inhuman quality of the NICE. Their policy is determined by pragnometry, not by people, but by almost like it reminds me of Twitter algorithms. There's this hidden, system of machines making decisions for the Institute that seems to determine the policy of the Institute. It's a scientific approach to science because the old scientists were too interested in their own little subjects. Now we're going to use a objective, rationalistic, inhuman method to determine what all the scientists are studying or doing. So how is anybody supposed to know what the program or policy of this overarching institute is? Yet the progressive element just automatically sort of uncritically just thinks, oh yeah, that sounds good. We need the science to help clean things up. Yeah. Also, this introduces the idea of sanitation as a euphemism. Euphemistically, it means, oh, we're going to clean up, all the poop off the streets. Oh, that's great. But what it also means is we're going to basically eradicate from people's lives any decision-making power. So if they like living in quote cozy little villages and drinking beer, that's not very sanitary. We're gonna mow that all down and build a nice, clean, minimalist, sanitary city on top of their cozy little villages and towns. We have a quote on page 39, but it is the main question at the moment. Which side one's on, obscurantism or order? It does really look as if we now had the power to dig ourselves in as a species for a pretty staggering period, to take control of our own destiny. If science is really given a free hand, it can now take over the human race and recondition it, make man a really efficient animal. If it doesn't, well, we're done. So they want to, so they are looking at human beings as things that can be molded to order in ways that are, again, sanitary and efficient. Page 40. As I said, the interplanetary problem must be left on one side for the moment. Oh, the interplanetary problem. The second problem is our rivals on this planet. I don't mean only insects and bacteria. There's far too much life of every kind about, animal and vegetable. We really haven't cleared the place yet. So
So yeah, so when we say sanitation, right, we're not just talking about cleaning the poop off the street. We're talking about basically getting rid of all extraneous life, essentially, right?
But the roundabout about it.
Yeah.
One thing about the pacing of this is that the farther that Mark goes, the more explicit and clear people get with him about what they want. So in this early stage, it's just we're just going to clean things up for the good of humanity. Later, they'll be a bit more specific. Yeah, we want to eliminate trees and plants and birds because we don't like any of those things. And then it gets pushed farther to where you eventually realize they really want to eliminate all human life as well as animal life. Right. One more observation about Dinner with the Subwarden is when Featherstone drives Mark to the NICE, he drives at this breakneck pace, kind of ignores crosswalks, mows over a few animals, and Mark looks at Featherstone as kind of like this image of masculinity with a pipe firmly clasped in his jaw, right? So Featherstone, when he's driving, doesn't care about animal life, doesn't care about enjoying the scenery. He's almost thinking, get to my location as fast as possible. It's a reemphasis of this machine, like get to the objective and damned with the pretty scenery and animal life and everything.
Right. So we don't care about the animal life. We don't care about appreciating the scenery. And we want to take charge of man. On page 40, man has got to take charge of man. That means, remember, that some men have got to take charge of the rest. And then later on, he talks about sterilizing the unfit, liquidation of backward races, selective breeding, then real education, including prenatal education. By real education, I mean one that has no take it or leave it nonsense. A real education makes the patient what it wants infallibly, whatever he or his parents try to do about it. I'm pretty sure I highlighted this because we have factions in our education system today that are trying to form kids in the way that they want, whatever their parents have to say about it. Which me as a teacher who works with students and has a good outside view of the public education system really grinds my gears. So that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately. So I'm sure I highlighted that for that reason.
One more highlight, since it's alluded to in the quote you had about the Interplanetary Problem. They allude to events in the first two books, but it's from Bilbury's perspective, not from Ransom's perspective. So as far as they know, Winston went off in space and got himself killed by Ransom on Venus. So when they explain this to Mark, they make it sound like Ransom just murdered the guy. And by the way, now that you're with us, guys in Ransom's camp might be coming after you. So not only is there kind of a vague dishonesty on what precisely they want to do. Now, when you had that quote earlier where they talk about, we do want to get rid of unfit races, they're willing in confidence to say some of what they're about, but they still couch everything they say in friendly or less punchy language. So in addition to that, there's also either deliberate lying or maybe they've been fed lies by their organization about what's gone on the other planet. So if you have read the first two books, there's another red light warning symbol that they're not being honest.
And it's interesting that you suggest the possibility that these people have not been told the truth by the higher ups. I think that's quite possible, since we have the structure in the NICE in which you have the outer circle and then you have the inner circle, right? So it is quite possible that the ones really at the top of this organization are keeping things from people that are lower down in the hierarchy. Because we don't want them to learn any misinformation. We have to control what they know. Speaking of the other things that are on my mind right now. So Chapter 3, Bilbury and St. Anne's on the Hill. What do we learn in Chapter 3?
I know that Mags, Jane's housekeeper, essentially, kind of like working class, plain girl. Jane has been harboring resentment against Mags because, again, Jane likes to think of herself as an intellectual woman. She doesn't like plain ordinary sorts of women. In Bilbury and St. Anne's on the Hill, I think Mark gets his first little glimpse of life in Bilbury, and Jane gets her first glimpse of life at St. Anne's. Once again, Jane has a mysterious dream, and she keeps having these sort of deja vu or awakening moments where she'll dream something or think of something. She'll think of a quote about how, beauty is the glory of a woman as well as a man, or the joy of a woman as well as a man. And just as she sits down and looks at a book, suddenly her eye will light on exactly that quote. Like, whoa, it was like I was thinking about that exact same thing 30 seconds ago. She has a dream about being led down a hallway to meet Grace Ironwood at St. Anne's. When Jane sees what's the other girl's name? It's the girl who's like extremely tall and lives at St. Anne's. And when Jane sees her, she immediately thinks, wow, she looks like exactly the sort of woman who could be, in a suit of armor, riding on a horse. So Jane's inadequacy is this feeling of wanting to be like this really impressive, kind of like warrior tomboy sort of woman, but kind of realizing that maybe she actually isn't that in and of herself. Right. Mark gets his first little interview at Bilbury with the deputy director, Mr. Wither. And Mr. Wither refuses to say anything explicitly. Everything has to be couched in, weasel words or phraseology. Yeah. All of it is very unassuming and friendly at first, but you just cannot get a straight answer to the question. Now, again, the theme of this whole book is building things gradually. The very first impression you have of Wither is that it's almost endearing, like just how evasive he's being, like maybe he's just a bit goofy or eccentric. But this is actually hiding a really nasty hidden side to Mr. Wither, where the reason he's so indirect with people is he absolutely hates communicating truthfully with anyone about anything. So underneath the gracious, I'm only thinking of your interests here exterior, Wither has like the world's worst boss mentality, where he'll dig his claws into you and give the knife a little dig in your back. Mark basically doesn't know what the hell he's doing here because Featherstone has got him the gig, but as soon as he goes over to where the sociologists are, they haven't heard anything about it and are kind of rude to him. And he started, I think this is where he starts to have the problem of, well, do I want to go back to my little college job, or do I want to stay here and get that 1,500 pounds a year and get deeper into the inner circle? So that desire to get deeper and deeper into the inner circle and be with the movers and shakers strings Mark along when he should be saying, this isn't what anybody told me it should be. I should get out of here as fast as possible. So his character flaw keeps pulling him further in. Right.
Yeah. So that's good that you point out that Wither's circumlocution, right? The fact that so Mark basically goes to Wither to ask him, what exactly is this appointment? What am I going to do? Like, he's trying to get a straight answer as to what is the job assignment, right? And Wither basically just spins him around the bend, telling him absolutely nothing, with a whole lot of circumlocutory weasel words, like you said, weasel words that say basically nothing. And I have to wonder if that was C.S. Lewis trying to comment upon the fact that in academic fields where they really don't have anything to say, they're just trying to make up BS knowledge that's not attached to the real world at all. That is, generally speaking, how they write, right? They write in a way that is supposed to be completely impenetrable to outside people, because if it was penetrable in any way, then people will realize that they're full of nonsense and hot air, right?
High word count, low thought count. There's a really good quote I just noticed where it sort of foreshadows the idea of Bilbury as something that consumes or absorbs the people who it gets. Oh, great! I just lost the page. All right. Basically, in their interview, Wither, in a roundabout way, says you can think of this place as a family or as a moment or grade in the progressive self-definition of an organic whole. So if you can work your way through the word salad, you realize that what Wither is saying is once you're part of us, we see ourselves as a single entity. We're not going to have room for an individual thinker here. We want you to be completely and totally in lockstep with our vision for whatever the NICE does. Right. And good luck finding out what that is from outside the circle.
Yeah. You have to be a part of the community. Right. And if you're a part of the community, that means you have to be completely elastic about what you're going to be willing to do for the sake of the community. Yeah.
He also meets Bill Hengist, Bill the Blizzard, who's a chemist and like a real scientist, right? Like Bill isn't even sure he respects sociology at whatsoever. And Mark loses his wallet. Dun dun dun. We'll see what is important about that.
Yeah. So Hengist, who was a physical chemist, was one of the 2 scientists at Bracton who had a reputation outside England. I hope the reader has not been misled into supposing that the Fellows of Bracton were a specially distinguished body. It was certainly not the intention of the progressive element to elect mediocrities to fellowships, but their determination to elect sound men cruelly limited their field of choice. And as Busby had once said, you can't have everything. I highlighted this because it's like, so when you limit your choice to the choice for people that you're going to elect to your fellowships, people who fit your political agenda, then what you ultimately get is people who are mediocrities, except for Hengist, who was known outside of England. Yeah. And yes, he loses his wallet. Dun, dun, dun. Yes, that's going to be important later. Let's see.
I've got some quotes about Fairy. Do you have anything about Fairy Hardcastle?
I do have a quote about Fairy. Yes.
All right. Good.
Yeah.
Good,
so
we meet her this chapter as well.
Yeah. So she appears in this chapter as well for the first time. Let's see. So he meets Fairy, and the quote that I have. But the Fairy pointed out that what had hampered every English police force up to date was precisely the idea of deserved punishment, for desert was always finite. You could do so much to the criminal and no more. Remedial treatment, on the other hand, need have no fixed limit. It could go on until it had effected a cure, and those who were carrying it out would decide when that was. And if cure were humane and desirable, how much more prevention? Soon anyone who had ever been in the hands of the police at all would come under the control of the NICE. In the end, every citizen. Whoa. So I highlighted this. This is a Fairy explaining the NICE's idea of remediation, basically social engineering, right? And how it's distinguished from giving people a punishment for their crimes, and then once they have served that punishment, they're punished. They got their deserved punishment. Now we leave them alone, right? But if we are talking about socially engineering society, that is basically a limitless proposition, and we can see that. And I'm sure I highlighted this because I was thinking about how certain factions today in our modern day society, they never define what exactly their end goal is, right? So and they do that very deliberately because it gives them a chance to just continue their crusade against whatever it is they're crusading against, right? Um, so we see this here, and I immediately connected to it because I know that today we have people out there now that want to continue to fight against racism or whatever without defining what the systemic racism is and what goal we are trying to get to in order to solve the situation. And again, it's very unclear for a very deliberate purpose, because systemic racism that is undefined can be fought forevermore. It need have no fixed limit. It can go on till it affected a cure, and those who are carrying it out would decide when that was, which will be never, because they want to have their little cozy sinecures engineering people instead of actually doing something useful for a change.
And Ferry is blunt about there being a social manipulative element to this. So she'll talk about how, oh, well, you want the ordinary person to hear the word punishment and think sadism. Later, we see that she has ambitions of the police element of the NICE essentially running the NICE. Everybody thinks that everybody else's department is going to be eliminated and they'll be the ones in charge. And Ferry's joke is that our police work, not knocking people over the head with clubs, that's really going to be the only sociology we're going to need in the NICE in the long run. She also has a lot of mannish mannerisms. She'll like sit on a chair and like kick up her legs over the arm of the chair and, chew her cheroot. Lewis has this great line that a smear of lipstick was her only concession to fashion. And she tells smoking room stories. And previously, Mark has sort of like rolled his eyes and laughed when women have tried to tell dirty stories. And he just takes pride in thinking, well, we men, we really know how to tell a dirty story. But Ferry Hardcastle actually tells such dirty stories that she shocks and embarrasses the men in the smoking room.
I have this quote from Hideous too, who Mark meets as Hideous is getting ready to leave the NICE, and Hideous says at one point, "There are no sciences like sociology, and if I found chemistry beginning to fit in with a secret police run by a middle-aged virago who doesn't wear corsets and a scheme for taking away his farm and his shop and his children from every Englishman, I'd let chemistry go to the devil and take up gardening again."
It's like Hengist has too much of the old British soul in him to go along with this, and he does have like he has a very objective scientific mindset. He's the perfect guy for the NICE, but he just doesn't like the idea of taking away a Brit's farm and his livestock. Kids these days, because he's old fashioned, it gives him enough of an individual spirit that he doesn't want to be taken in by this group.
Yeah, and the response is, I think I do understand the sentiment that still attaches to the small man. But when you come to study the reality as I have to do, I should want to pull it to bits and put something else in its place. Of course, that's what happens when you study men. You find mare's nests. I happen to believe that you can't study men. You can only get to know them, which is quite a different thing. Because you study them, you want to make the lower orders govern the country and listen to classical music, which is balderdash. You also want to take away from them everything which makes life worth living, and not only from them, but from everyone except a parcel of prigs and professors. So, I suppose there are two views about everything, said Mark.
It's noteworthy that Mark gets a warning from someone smarter than him inside Bilbury as he's trying to get out, that you don't want to get into this. So Mark conveniently ignores warning signs or danger signals telling him to stay away from this.
Right. Let's see. She was, I have one from Jane here. She was not indeed sure that it was nonsense, but she had already resolved to treat it as if it were. She would not get mixed up in it, would not be drawn in. One had to live one's own life. To avoid entanglements and interferences had long been one of her first principles. Even when she had discovered that she was going to marry Mark if he asked her, the thought, but I must still keep up my own life, had arisen at once and had never for more than a few minutes at a stretch been absent from her mind. Some resentment against love itself, and therefore against Mark, for thus invading her life remained. She was at least very vividly aware how much a woman gives up in getting married. Mark seemed to her insufficiently aware of this. Though she did not formulate it, this fear of being invaded and entangled was the deepest ground of her determination not to have a child, or not for a long time yet. One had one's own life to live. So I highlighted this because it demonstrates, as you were saying, Jane's principal problem, which is that she doesn't want to be tied down by any obligation at all. She wants to, as she says, be her own person, to have her own life to live, and not have any responsibility or obligations to anyone else. So she and Mark are married unhappily, in part because Jane is unwilling to let Mark be a full part of her life, right?
Yeah.
To let Mark have any control over what she does in her own life. Okay, and that ends my quotes for chapter 3.
It ends with Jane getting a terrified call from Mother Dimble saying something dreadful has happened. And that leads us into chapter 4, where we learn that because of the sale of the property, the NICE is now sent a ton of workmen roughly running around, trampling on people's gardens, walking into people's houses, and the Dimbles basically have to get out of their own house.
Yeah, and this chapter, by the way, is called "The Liquidation of the Anachronisms," which is a great title, because that's basically what's going on. Yeah, it's the NICE getting rid of all the things that interfere with their plans to make this sterile, scientifically controlled environment, right? So that includes
last few sentences cut out there. I heard up, and then I did it, and then I got like the last part of that sentence.
Okay. Well, I was saying that the title of the chapter, the liquidation of the anachronisms.
Gotcha. Okay. I think it resolved whatever it was.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that's not a sign that I'm about to drop off. But yeah, that's a perfect chapter, because that's essentially what the NIC is trying to do with all the sweaty, gruff workmen, basically destroying everything that was charming about Bracton, right? So, because all the things that are charming about this, English college town are things that are old-fashioned and unsanitary, and quote unquote unsanitary, right? So I have this quote on page 85.
Okay.
Yeah, with Kosser and Mark, right? A bloody awful noise those birds make, said Kosser. Got your map? So they walked about that village for 2 hours and saw with their own eyes all the abuses and anachronisms they came to destroy. They saw the recalcitrant and backward laborer and heard his views on the weather. They met the wastefully supported pauper in the person of an old man, shuffling across the courtyard of the almshouses to fill a kettle, and the elderly rentier, to make matters worse, she had a fat old dog with her, in earnest conversation with the postman. It made Mark feel as if he were on holiday, for it was only on holidays that he had ever wandered about. Yeah, all these undesirable people. Yeah, for that reason, he felt pleasure in it. It did not quite escape him that the face of the backward laborer was rather more interesting than Kosser's, and his voice a great deal more pleasing to the ear. That's the part I highlighted, because he's walking around this village, surveying all the things that the NIC is about to destroy, right? And he has this, I guess I would define it as sort of a second thought, because he realizes that all of these people that are quote unquote undesirable, there's a part of him that thinks that they are more interesting than the intellectual Kasser, right? So there's this other aspect. So we were talking about how Mark is his major flaw is that he goes along to get along, that he's all about being popular, right? But he still has the capacity to recognize on some level that something is not quite right about the situation that he has found himself
You're
in.
still cutting in and out a little bit. It was better for a second, and now it's starting to, like, you're losing like a couple words each sentence now. Yeah. Maybe do you maybe have anything running on the background on the internet or something?
Nope, I just have the stream and my Kindle up.
I'm just going to make sure I don't have anything running on my end that could be slowing it down for me. But what I got is that Mark meets these people. I heard you say he has the second thought. They're kind of interesting. Their voices are more pleasant. They have nice beer. And I recall he has a conversation in one of the taverns that, whenever we get rid of this, we have to make sure that whatever we're building will be as nice in its own way. And his partner just commented, well, people are going to have their stimulants like beer. I prefer they be administered scientifically. So to the pure inhuman scientific mind, what's the difference if you drink a beer with your friends versus just give them an injection to stimulate the chemical effect of beer?
Right.
Mark, as a sociologist, has studied people like this. He thinks of himself as a egalitarian Democrat, but he's never actually been around the people he spent his life studying and writing essays about. So there's something striking about that experience that he can't quite define yet. And he certainly can't explain it to the Bilbury types.
Yeah. And it's that is an enduring feature of intellectuals, I think. The ones that seem to be in charge of the dominant zeitgeist, both in Lewis's time and in our own, seem to have no connection whatsoever to actual real people. They seem to, as our boy Zach would say, they don't human very well.
Yep.
But Mark, fortunately, he has the ability to understand on some level the actual human aspect of society. And that's ultimately what's going to save him in the end, is that he hasn't completely gone around the bend. The only reason that he has been sucked into this is because of his desire for esteem, essentially. The fact that he wants to be liked by the popular set, right? But he still has that capacity to be human and to recognize humanity in other people.
He has that capacity to.
What was that?
Yeah, I think I hear your sound okay again. Sorry, I heard he has that capacity to be blank, and then I lost the last phrase of the question.
Okay, so he has the capacity to see the humanity in people, right?
There we go. So to see humanity in people. All right. Gotcha. Yes. Also of note is that while Mark is doing this, he still has a vaguely defined position at the NICE, and he thinks that going along on this trip is proof that, okay, well, now I must have a position, and maybe I'm under this guy, maybe not, but he's very, again, anytime he tries to ask a question, hoping to suss out, is this guy my boss? Now they'll avoid answering the question in a way that gives him that information. Jane has a dream in the same chapter. Jane has a vision, not a dream, of an old man being beaten. And what we can put two and two together is that that's Hengist, and Hengist has been assaulted and killed. And Jane even observes that the people who do it are kind of scientific and casual about it. Like they beat him about the head, they bend over to check on him and see if they did a good work, did a good job of it.
Right. All right, so that is basically what I have for chapter 4.
One last comment is he meets Strake, and Mr. Strake weirdly speaks of Jesus Christ and God and the coming to Britain, and people just seem to like let him go on about it, and they don't stop him, which to Mark seems really strange, and it makes Mark very uncomfortable. But what Strake is getting at is that somehow on Earth, death will be conquered and the wicked will be punished forever, and that the story of Jesus in the Bible was merely a metaphor for what will be coming in their time. So there's this in this very secular environment, there's this very strange religious presence that Mark doesn't understand, because unlike Jane, Mark was raised completely outside the church. So if Jane left the church, Mark is just completely unfamiliar with this language and the meaning of this stuff, apart from, like learning a few biblical phrases in elementary school.
Right. And Strake, I believe he is there as a character to show that even the church can be corrupted by this sort of philosophy, right?
And Strake, ironically, thinks the entire church is corrupted except for himself. He's the only religious person who has seen through the true meaning of the Bible to figure out that the Bilbury is going to bring about the new heaven and the new earth and the destruction of the wicked. Yeah.
Right. And all right, so that's the final note there on chapter 4. And now we have chapter 5, elasticity.
Elasticity.
Yeah. So the first quote I have, what is this from? Oh, so he's talking to Fairy again, right? If you'll trust me, said the Fairy, putting down her empty glass and producing a cheroot, I can put you onto a bit of your real work. What you were really brought here to do straight away. What's that? Alakazam, said Miss Hardcastle between her teeth. Started one of her interminable dry smokes. Then, glancing at Mark with a contempt, you know who I'm talking about, don't you? You mean the radiologist, the man who was guillotined? Asked Mark, who was completely bewildered. The Fairy nodded. He is to be rehabilitated, she said, gradually. I've got all the facts in the dossier. You begin with a quiet little article, not questioning his guilt, not at first, but just hinting that of course he was a member of their quizzling government, and there was a prejudice against him. Say you don't doubt the verdict was just, but it's disquieting to realize that it would almost certainly have been the same, even if he'd been innocent. Then followed up in a day article of a quite different kind, popular account of the value of his work. You can mug up the facts, enough for that kind of article in an afternoon. Then a letter, rather indignant, to the paper that printed the first article, and going much further. The execution was a miscarriage of justice. By that time, what on earth is the point of all this? I'm telling you, Studdock, Alakazam is to be rehabilitated, made into a martyr, an irreparable loss to the human race. But what for? There you go again. You grumble about being given nothing to do, and as soon as I suggest a bit of real work, you expect to have the whole plan of the campaign told you before you do it. It doesn't make sense. That's not the way to get on here. The great thing is to do what you're told. If you turn out to be any good, you'll soon understand what's going on. But you've got to begin by doing the work.
And creating sock puppet accounts to create the illusion of a debate going on in the newspapers. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we have this. Yeah. So basically, now we get to see. It started off with people just talking about their philosophical ideas about cleansing the world of its inefficiencies and so on. But now, for the first time, Mark is being asked to do something that is objectively immoral for this cause, right? And at first he's hesitating, which is why Fairy Hardcastle has to tell him, just do what you're told, right?
She also believes that the working classes are going to be harder to gull than the middle classes, because it's the middle classes that read the enlightened columns and opinion and editorial pieces, and the working classes just want to look at the sports scores and read funny stories about ladies falling out of windows and things.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah,
also of note is that Mark gets screwed by his colleague. He finds out that his colleague lied to him about what they were going to Cure Hardy to do. And basically the guy takes all the credit for the work and reveals that he was just doing it in his spare time. So Mark was under the impression he was actually working for the Institute. And then he finds out that I've just been dragged along for a day of my time I'll never get back.
Both, honey, both, said Miss Hardcastle. Don't you understand anything? Isn't it absolutely essential to keep a fierce left and a fierce right, both on their toes and each terrified of the other? That's how we get things done. Any opposition to the NICE is represented as a left racket in the right papers and a right racket in the left papers. Yep. If it's properly done, you get each side outbidding the other in support of us to refute the enemy slanders. Of course we're non-political. The real power always is. I don't believe you can do that, said Mark. Not with the papers that are read by educated people. That shows you're still in the nursery, Lovey, said Miss Hardcastle. Haven't you yet realized that it's the other way around? How do you mean? Why, you fool, it's the educated reader who can be gulled. All our difficulty comes with the others. When did you meet a workman who believes the papers? He takes it for granted that they're all propaganda and skips the leading articles. He buys his paper for the football results, the little paragraphs about girls falling out of windows and corpses found in Mayfair flats. He is our problem. We have to recondition him. But the educated public, the people who read the highbrow weeklies, don't need reconditioning. They're all right already. They'll believe anything. Which is...
official sources say.
Yeah. That is incredibly insightful on C.S. Lewis's part, and is certainly true today. I think they came out with a poll or a study of some kind that was looking at how people on one side of the political aisle perceived the viewpoints of the other side.
Yeah.
And they found that the most educated respondents that were most exposed to media were less likely to correctly perceive the viewpoints of people on the other side. Yeah. C.S. Lewis has it right. It's the educated people that are more likely to be gulled by what they read in the papers. Yes.
It's almost a foreshadowing of the those bell curve memes, like the caveman on the one side, the midwit soy jack in the middle, and then like the elite genius wizard on the far right.
Yeah. Yeah, so midwit in the middle thinks that the papers are trustworthy. Yeah.
Mark also has an interview with Wither where he desperately tries to get confirmation if he actually has a job there. Wither doesn't even remember his name at first, and Mark keeps having what he thinks are general conversations where he's just asking for clarification. And later he finds out that he got on Wither's nerves, and that just for asking him very straightforward questions, Wither now resents him or thinks that he's betraying the family by talking about leaving.
Right. And then we have Jane meeting with Ransom for the first time. And that meeting is interesting because of the feeling that comes over her when she meets him for the first time. That feeling of basically she would follow him everywhere, right? Which is which is basically in contradiction to her desire to want to be her own person and to not have any obligation or any other person tying her down, right?
She encounters something that throws apart her entire world that she's constructed. She's constructed this whole little world where she's a special, smart, serious person. She doesn't want anybody getting involved in her life. And she meets someone who is like her childhood idea of King Arthur. So even if she's consciously annoyed at the idea of meeting this patriarchal guy who runs this weird little society and not wanting to be taken in, when she meets him and she finds him to be a remarkable person, that realization blows up the framework she had for how she looks at the world. Now she has to make sense of this world where there is this heroic King Arthur type of figure that speaks to, it was her when she was a little girl dreaming of, knights in shining armor. That kind of person really exists, and she doesn't know how to categorize that as an adult.
Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, we also have the NICE trying to convince Mark to bring Jane to Bilbury because they know that Jane is having visions about what they are doing. So they want to bring her under their control, right? So that she won't basically blow their cover, right?
Yep. Also, we get our first little foreshadowing of how Wither is known to roam the halls whistling a dreary tune. And so it's not like exactly like he's listening in on you, but because the whistling announces his presence. But Mark tries to have a conversation with Stone, who's getting raked over the coals by Wither, and Mark can kind of tell that Stone might be on his way out, like a sinking ship. And every time Mark tries to talk to Stone, suddenly there's that whistle, and there's the deputy director slinking around, he's a big, tall man stooped over. So he's a weirdly omnipresent personality in Bilbury. This is another little foreshadowing of something that's going to be important later, where we find out why the director seems to be everywhere at once.
Right, exactly. So then we get to chapter 6, Fog. So we get this. Now the weather is reflecting exactly what's going on in the real world. A very literary thing. And so basically this fog comes over the region here. And basically what happens in this is, hang on, I'm looking at my notes again.
People are getting sick of Bracton College for having allowed these NICE people to run around, run rampant
exactly.
everywhere.
Yeah. And so we have the town, which did not usually share the opinions of the university, was also in an unsettled condition. The disturbance in which the Bracton window had been broken was taken little notice of in the London papers or even in the Edgestowe Telegraph, but it was followed by other episodes. There was an indecent assault in one of the mean streets down by the station. There were 2 beatings up in a public house. There were increasing complaints of threatening and disorderly behavior on the part of the NICE workmen, but these complaints never appeared in the papers. Those who had actually seen ugly incidents were surprised to read in the Telegraph that the new institute was settling down very comfortably in Edgestowe, and the most cordial relations developing between it and the natives. Those who had not seen them, but only heard of them, finding nothing in the Telegraph, dismissed the stories as rumors or exaggerations. Those who had seen them wrote letters to it, but it did not print their letters. Yep. So we're starting to see some discontent going on between the people who are native to this town and the NICE workmen who have come in, the outsiders who have come in, and this has involved actual outright criminal behavior, but the papers are covering it up. And my
Fact
goodness, is that relevant to things that are happening today? Yeah. Where we're not going to talk about that what's really going on. We're going to cover it up and anyone who dares try to talk about what's really going on gets shut down because they're spreading quote unquote misinformation.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really gets to the heart of one of our problems today, that people who are closest to let's say our southern border, the people who are closest to our southern border know the kind of disorder that's going on down there, but the blue checks refuse to talk about it or refuse to acknowledge that those problems exist, right? So we have this written at mid 20th century, and it is wildly relevant to things that are happening today, for sure. Let's see.
Meanwhile, Mark is getting raked over the coals at Bilbury because because he's leaving his job at college for Bilbury. They're going to kick him out of the college. Because he's not willing to leave his job at the college. They're going to kick him out of Bilbury. He says it feels like I'm about to fall between two stools. He tries to talk to Featherstone and say, look, I didn't tell anyone I was planning to leave the college, and you're partially responsible for spreading that rumor. Can't you help me make clear that I'm actually not planning to leave the college? And Featherstone basically makes it clear, well, I can't get you fired, but I'm also not going to support you when you come up for re-election. In a very sadistic way, he eats a muffin and calls him a hopeless romantic. So what Mark has figured out is he's now about to lose his job at the college. He's now desperate for a job, absolutely desperate for a job at Bilbury, but the deputy director has given up his nice act and is now thoroughly displeased with him in his sort of dispassionate, indirect way. So he's offered a pittance compared to what he was first offered. And he's basically considers himself lucky even to get like 600 pounds a year, less than half of what he was initially offered. And he meekly submits to it. Just like Jane somewhat blames Mark for interrupting her life, Mark tells himself, well, if I didn't have a wife, I'd never put up with that. So in a way, it's all Jane's fault that I'm letting these people push me around and walk all over me. I'm doing it. I'm so sacrificially doing it for my little wife. Yeah.
Yeah, and we also discover in this chapter that that Ferry Hardcastle has been engineering some of these disturbances so that the NIC will be able to install their own emergency police at Edstow. Right. You'll never get the powers you want at Edstow until the government declares that a state of emergency exists there. So they're in the process of engineering a riot that will justify the NICE police coming in.
And even as he's talking about it, Mark is shocked and surprised because this is criminal. But in order to fit in, he has to pretend that this is sort of like a ironic joke that he's in on. And Lewis has the comment that the moment of decision passed by in his laughter. So as he's sort of quietly going along with things, what he doesn't realize he's doing is he's bypassing the moments where he needs to make a firm decision. And it's almost like whoop, the train went by. He didn't even realize he just made an important decision right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's how a man can do a terrible thing without himself yet being a terrible man.
Realizing that he's doing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they loop him into he has to write the accounts of this riot before it's actually happened, and he's confused. But how are we to write it tonight if the thing doesn't even happen till tomorrow at the earliest? And everyone bursts out laughing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You'll never manage publicity that way, Mark said Feverstone. You certainly don't need to wait for a thing to happen before you tell the story of it. Yeah. Yeah, and then I have this quote. This was the first thing Mark had been asked to do, which he himself, before he did it, clearly knew to be criminal. But the moment of his consent almost escaped his notice. Certainly, there was no struggle, no sense of turning a corner. There may have been a time in the world's history when such moments fully revealed their gravity, with witches prophesying on a blasted heath or visible Rubicons to be crossed. But for him, it all slipped past in a chatter of laughter, of that intimate laughter between fellow professionals, which of all earthly powers is strongest to make men do very bad things before they are yet individually very bad men. Yeah. So, yeah. So he's pulling in here the fact that he's pulling in the, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. He's pulling in the fact that many men who aren't objectively bad men get pulled into doing very bad things because of flaws in human nature. In particular, in Mark's case, what he represents is the fact that human beings want to be esteemed by fellow human beings. So they will often do things to earn fame or to earn popularity that aren't, in fact, genuinely moral and upstanding things. And it's not that they launched into enterprises like that with the intention to be evil and to do evil things, but that's what they end up doing because of this, because of the tendency among some, or the tendency in human nature to conform to whoever is around you, right? Right. That's basically what Mark did. He doesn't want to be seen as some sort of he doesn't want to be seen as some sort of upstart, right? He doesn't want to be seen as someone who is going against whatever is popular, right? So he goes along and he laughs with them instead of actually standing up and taking a stand. And that's oftentimes, as C.S. Lewis observes, that's oftentimes how evil works, is it convinces people to be afraid to stand up and take a stand for what's really right.
Also, as a reward for submitting to them, he's allowed to join the inner group in the library. So the library ostensibly is supposed to be public and open for everyone, but really it's only for people who are part of the inner circle of Bilbury, which includes Strake, Winter, and Philostrato, and a few others. They talk a little bit more explicitly about starting to eliminate organic life. It's Philostrato especially who's interested in it because he finds organic things filthy, poop and dead leaves everywhere. If you had a metal tree, well, then you could move that metal tree around anywhere. You don't have to clean up after it. You could have mechanical birds that sing only when you want them to sing, and you can flip the switch and have them stop singing. That disturbing conversation takes place, and Mark has to write 2 articles about the same riots in Edgestowe. One is clearly written for an intellectual audience that talks about, like the British character, and we the British people, we're not overly enamored with logic, ha ha ha. And he also writes what's clearly for a working class audience, where it says the NICE is the boxing glove on the fist of democracy. I think maybe it's foreigners, maybe it's the Jews, maybe it's the capitalists who are engineering the riots in Edgestowe. It's sneaky because it's a partial truth. The riots in Edgestowe were engineered, but the working class article makes it out that some other evil force is doing it to the NICE, and the NICE is on the side of the common working man. So Mark is getting excited by his own rhetorical brilliance of his writing. He's actually kind of been forced to admit that maybe the reason he did so well at getting a college position isn't because he's especially brilliant, but because he knows how to write using striking phraseology, which is perfect for propaganda writing. Right,
exactly.
Lewis also has a great one last good line. Lewis has the line that once a man is crossing the T's and dotting the I's, he's no longer intending to throw it away, even if he knows it's lies.
Yeah. And meanwhile, what is going on with Jane? in this chapter?
Let me see.
She is having a dream.
I found it. The place, wherever it was, did not seem very large. She groped all along one of the rough walls, and then turning at a corner, struck her foot against something hard.
Yeah.
She has a vision of a corpse. Yeah, a corpse buried underground.
Yeah. So she's dreaming of a corpse underground, which turns out to be Merlin later. So she's seeing where Merlin is, right?
And importantly, she sees that you can walk down a hallway towards Merlin. The NICE we put two and two together and realized the NICE are looking for the body of Merlin. So they're just digging everywhere, hoping to find it from above. And she's figured out that in that cavern, you can go horizontally out underneath. You can get in underneath where the NICE is digging. But she doesn't yet know precisely what's going on, in part because Mr. McPhee and some of the others have thought if she knows too much about what's actually going on, those ideas could interfere with dreams or her visions. Yeah.
Okay, so then we get to the Pendragon, chapter 7.
The Return of King Arthur, yeah.
The Return of King Arthur, yep. So, let's see. The first quote I have here. It's more Mark talking to the director here.
Well, and we meet Mr. Bultitude, right?
Yeah, we meet Bultitude. So let's see. All right, so the first quote I have is on page 142. I thought the danger was right on top of us now, from the way Mrs. Denniston talked. That is just the question, said the director with a smile. I'm not allowed to be too prudent. I am not allowed to use desperate remedies until desperate diseases are really apparent. Otherwise, we become just like our enemies, breaking all the rules whenever we imagine that it might possibly do some vague good to humanity in the remote future. But will it do any harm if I come here? Asked Jane. He did not directly answer this. Presently, he spoke again. It looks as if you will have to go back, at least for the present. You will, no doubt, be seeing your husband again fairly soon. I think you must make at least one effort to detach him from the NICE. But how can I, sir? Said Jane. What have I to say to him? He'll think it all nonsense. He wouldn't believe all that about an attack on the human race. As soon as she had said it, she wondered, did that sound cunning? Then more disconcertingly, was it cunning? No, said the director, and you must not tell him. You must not mention me nor the company at all. We have put our lives in your hands. You must simply ask him to leave Bilbury. You must put it on your own wishes. You are his wife. Mark never takes any notice of what I say, answered Jane. She had marked each thought of that of the other. Perhaps, said the director, you have never asked anything, as you will be able to ask this. Do you not want to save him as well as yourself? Jane ignored this question. Now that the threat of expulsion from the house was imminent, she felt a kind of desperation, heedless of that inner commentator, who had more than once during this conversation shown her own words and wishes in such a novel light. She began speaking rapidly. Don't send me back, she said. I am all alone at home with terrible dreams. It isn't as if Mark and I saw much of one another at the best of times. I am so unhappy. He won't care whether I come here or not. He'd only laugh at it all if he knew. Is it fair that my whole life should be spoiled just because he's got mixed up with some horrible people? You don't think a woman is to have no life of her own just because she's married?
What's interesting about this whole exchange is it's directly speaking to essentially Jane's a proto-feminist and dislikes patriarchal society. Yes. She dislikes stories like the myth of Andromeda's, I think, because Andromeda is her father promises Andromeda's hand in marriage to whoever defeats the sea monster. So she looks at history through this kind of like lens of patriarchy putting down women. Ransom is asking her to have Mark's permission before she joins the company, which in a direct attack on her idea of, well, I should decide whether I'm part of this company. It's not Mark's decision whether I'm part of this company. At the same time, she has an unhappy marriage and very little confidence in her relationship with her husband at the exact same time. So it's sort of like the feminist offer of individual power and strength is, it sounds good, but it's not actually real at all in Jane's life. She has no ability to like talk to her husband and ask anything of her husband, and that's the price she's paid for this desperate sort of inward kind of radical individualism that doesn't let Mark into her life.
Right, and we get to here on page 144, starting on page 144, she says, and her heart sank, for now it seemed to her that this conversation, to which she had vaguely looked for some sort of deliverance from all problem, was in fact involving her in new ones. It was not his fault, she said at last. I suppose our marriage was just a mistake. The director said nothing. What would the people you are talking of say about a case like that? I will tell you if you really want to know, said the director. Please, said Jane reluctantly. They would say, he answered, that you do not fail in obedience through lack of love, but have lost love because you never attempted obedience. So I highlighted this because it's very, very countercultural. Yeah, it's very, very countercultural. The idea that, but it is biblical, the idea that a wife should obey her husband, right?
Right.
And that love can be found in that obedience, right? And what's interesting is how she reacts to this. Something in Jane that would normally have reacted to such a remark with anger or laughter was banished to a remote distance, where she could still, but only just, hear its voice, by the fact that the word obedience, but certainly not obedience to Mark, came over her in that room and in that presence like a strange oriental perfume, perilous, seductive, and ambiguous. Stop it, said the director sharply. Jane stared at him, open-mouthed. There were a few moments of silence during which the exotic fragrance faded away.
Implying that there's interference of Eldil activity of some kind. I actually wasn't sure if that was supposed to be the dark Eldil or the good Eldil that he's referring to there. But so there is this recurring theme that as people have, kind of like emotional experiences and hidden thoughts, there's a way in which the Eldil are guiding or shaping that.
Yes. You were saying, my dear, resumed the director, I thought love meant equality, she said, and free companionship. Now, here's another barnstormer right here. Equality, said the director. We must talk of that some other time. Yes, we must all be guarded by equal rights from one another's greed because we are fallen. Just as we must all wear clothes with the same reason. But the naked body should be there underneath the clothes, ripening for the day when we shall need them no longer. Equality is not the deepest thing,
Picking up on the
I
idea
always
that
thought that was just what it was.
It's picking up on the idea that equality could become a god in itself, and then you try to make people be equal by force. Yeah.
But it's also suggesting that equality is a concession to our fallen nature and not an actual genuine good, too.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought that was just what it was. I thought it was in their souls that people were equal. You were mistaken, he said gravely. That is the last place where they are equal. Equality before the law, equality of incomes, that's all very well. That is very well. Equality guards life. It doesn't make it. It is medicine, not food. You might as well try to warm yourself with a blue book. It's an interesting view of equality that says the reason why we have equality under the law is to protect people from fallen human nature, and not because equality is, again, some good that we should idolize above all other goods.
meaning after sin, inequality becomes a source of joy. There are things that are different from myself that I can love, and they can be different from me in very fundamental ways. But both of these different things can be good. So the masculine and the feminine could fall into that category.
Yeah.
Even just things like different outlooks, or like the lower class and the upper class could be different, beautiful reflections of things.
Yeah, he even says obedience, humility is an erotic necessity. That was one that I put down. That is one note that I highlighted there. So they never warned you. No one has ever told you that obedience, humility is an erotic necessity. You are putting equality just where it ought not to be. As to your coming here, yeah. So he's saying that the reason why your marriage has been dry is that you have not approached it with humility, right? That in fact, obedience and humility are the things that make sex possible, basically.
She's trying to keep her own sense of identity to herself. She has not created the opportunity for Mark Mark isn't man enough to be a good husband yet, but Jane has never given him an opportunity to have much involvement in her life anyway, even if he was that kind of the man she needed.
Yeah. There, he said, a very simple adjustment. This is after the rats come in, or the mice come in. Humans want crumbs removed. Rice are anxious to remove them. It ought never to been a cause of war. But you see that obedience and rule are more like a dance than a drill, especially between man and woman, where the roles are always changing. So he's saying that obedience shouldn't be seen as something that is oppressive, right? That it is something if everything is if everything, including the beasts, are obeying their place in the hierarchy, or their place in the world, their place in creation, then it wouldn't be experienced as oppressive. It'd be experienced as, this is the role that I am meant to play, right?
And illustrating it is a lot of the wives in Ransom's household are not Stepford wives. Grace Ironwood is a intelligent and impressive older woman. Mrs. Dimble has kind of a playful tete-a-tete with her husband, and it includes things like men were made to be talked to. It teaches them to ignore you and focus on their work, right? Yeah. So there's almost like a chipper sense of humor about the give and take between the marriage relationships, where it's not a brainless woman blindly doing everything her husband says, but it is a woman who is sort of cognizant of obedience as her job, and because of that, then the woman gains power and gains influence in the relationship or dance. And I think the whole point is that if you reduce it to a mechanical contract, you lose the point of what the marriage is, because the marriage has to be conducted between two individuals who love each other, and that human experience is almost beyond a mechanistic, legal, contractual arrangement, whereas if you look at it through a feminist lens and you say, well, it's men ruling over women, that means you're looking at it through a political, social contract, logical view of things that can't capture the reality of what a happy marriage is emotionally.
Right. And what happens in this give and take in the natural marriage that isn't being invaded by political concerns is you have the woman being obedient to the husband, but this is something that always gets missed in that biblical verse. It says, "Wives, be obedient to your husbands," but then it says, "Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church." Right. So. Well, what does that actually mean when you think about it? Well, how did Christ love the church? He sacrificed himself, went through extraordinary torture to absolve us of our sins, right? So, the man's side of the marriage is not about ruling the woman; it's about sacrificing for the woman.
Right. So Mark needs to become a king. Mark needs to become a Christ-like heroic knightly figure. But that's Mark's job. Basically, Jane has to focus on what Jane's job is, not on what Mark's job is.
Right. So I have this little bookmark part. The director obviously insisted on it. At the very moment when her mind was most filled with another man, there arose, clouded with some undefined emotion, a resolution to give Mark much more than she had ever given him before, and a feeling that in so doing, she would be really giving it to the director. And this produced in her such a confusion of sensations that the whole inner debate became indistinct and flowed over into the larger experience of the fourth Jane, who was Jane herself, and dominated all the rest at every moment without effort and even without choice. So we have going on this kind of internal conversation in her head as she's processing all this information about the importance of obedience in marriage, right? And we see in here part of her that is resolving to give Mark much more than she had ever given him before. So there's a part of her that realizes that there is something true in this that she should probably be paying attention to, right? And that in serving her role as the obedient wife in the marriage, she will, in fact, be serving the director and, by implication, God himself, right? In actually fulfilling the role that you were meant to play. Yeah.
Right. Lewis describes Jane's. I love when Lewis describes how people think, because he always pays attention to the mental picture in a person's mind.
Yeah.
So his description of it is that Jane suddenly has 4 Janes within her that are thinking of the same experience. Right. There's a little girl, Jane, who's just kind of sweetly, almost has a little girl crush on the big, strong director. There's the prim and proper Jane who wants to be taken seriously. There's a third Jane, and it's described as a new and unexpected visitant. The third Jane is sort of aware of how she's been treating Mark and feels like, well, it was Mark who made the mistake marrying me because I haven't given Mark anything. I should make an attempt to be nice to Mark. And then the fourth Jane is the fourth and supreme Jane, was simply in the state of joy. So if the little girl Jane has kind of a childlike enthusiasm, the fourth Jane, I would assume, is sort of a mature and adult Jane who is also experiencing the same joy and enthusiasm, but in a deeper and richer way. So as Jane is willing to question the sort of feminist modern vision of herself, she's able to find new ideas or new kind of sources of inspiration and joy within herself that are described as other Janes, kind of fighting with one another. But then the fourth and final Jane kind of overpowers the three and creates how she's actually feeling. So if you were to ask her, how are you actually feeling? The fourth Jane becomes who she is and how she's actually looking at the situation while debating with these other Janes in her mind.
Right. Anything else you want to say about chapter 7 before we move on?
Yeah, I think it triggered all the right people.
Yeah, when we start talking about obedience in marriage, I think that a bunch of people are gonna, a bunch of moderns are going to be, how dare you even suggest that that's actually the healthy way to go.
Should be mentioned is that Jane is kidnapped and tortured by Fairy Hardcastle and the Nice Police. It's a really terrifying scene. And Hardcastle sort of snapped out of it at the last minute, also foreshadowing how there's a lot of miscommunication and disorder in the Nice, because the police girls know that Fairy Hardcastle gets sexual pleasure out of torturing people, and especially young girls. So they're hesitant to interrupt her. When they finally do interrupt her, she's running late. And so that chaos gives Jane essentially the opportunity she needs to escape and rush back to St. Anne's for care.
Right. So then we get to Chapter 8, Moonlight at Bilbury.
Wither is
right, and
trying to put Fairy Hardcastle over the coals for capturing and torturing Jane. Hardcastle's having none of it because she knows all about Wither's elasticity routine, and she knows that if you do something impulsive, you'll be criticizing for disobeying orders. If you don't do something impulsive, you'll be criticized for refusing to take initiative. So Hardcastle is fully well aware of Wither's manipulative tactics.
Yeah, right. And most of the highlights I have here in this chapter is talking about the desire of the Nice to get rid of basically all organic life, which and that explains the title of the chapter, Moonlight at Bilbury, because in the planetary world that Lewis has constructed here, the moon is the sterile environment, right, where the fallen Eldil reigns supreme, and basically gets rid of anything having to do with anything organic, right? So the emphasis on the moon is very deliberate there, because that's what the moon represents, is that desire for sterility, that desire to cleanse everything that is that we would traditionally consider beautiful, because it is inefficient and unsanitary, right?
Right. And the race of the moon, they have cold marriages because they reproduce their infants artificially, and they sleep with cunningly devised machines because their feelings are so delicate. Like a real sex can't possibly satisfy them, so they essentially need like robotic sex machines to satisfy them. Again, foreshadowing like weird, virtual reality in the pornography problem, I think. Yeah.
So I have on page 169. Oh yes, replied Philostrato. The pretty trees, the garden trees, but not the savages. I put the rose in my garden, but not the briar. The forest tree is a weed, but I tell you, I have seen the civilized tree in Persia. It was a French attaché who had it because he was in a place where trees do not grow. It was made of metal, a poor, crude thing. But how if it were perfected? Light, made of aluminum, so natural it would even deceive. It would hardly be the same as a real tree, said Winter. But consider the advantages. You get tired of him in one place, 2 workmen carry him somewhere else, wherever you please. It never dies. No leaves to fall, no twigs, no birds building nests, no muck and mess. I suppose 1 or 2, as curiosities, might be rather amusing. Why 1 or 2? At present, I allow we must have forests for the atmosphere. Presently, we find a chemical substitute. And then why any natural trees? I foresee nothing but the art tree all over the earth. In fact, we clean the planet. Do you mean, put in a man called Gould, that we are to have no vegetation at all? Exactly. You shave your face. Even in the English fashion, you shave him every day. One day, we shave the planet. So
Philostrato is in on something that a lot of the library people are not in on.
Yeah. So there's this, it's driven by this disgust of anything that is not cool and clean and mechanical, essentially. It kind of reminds me of Korvac's vision in the Iron Man comics, just FYI, right?
Exactly.
He wants everyone to be, unified crystal instead of the messy, free, living sapient beings that they are, right? Sort of the same impulse is going on here. Let's see. And you, especially you English, are you not hostile to any organic life except your own on your own body? Rather than permit it, you have invented the daily bath. That's true. And what do you call dirty dirt? Is it not precisely the organic? Minerals are clean dirt, but the real filth is what comes from organisms, sweat, spittles, excretions. Is not your whole idea of purity one huge example? The impure and the organic are interchangeable conceptions. What are you driving at, Professor Sadgould? After all, we are organisms ourselves. I grant it. That is the point. In us, organic life has produced mind. It has done its work. After that, we want no more of it. We do not want the world any longer furred over with organic life, like what you call the blue mold, all sprouting and budding and breeding and decaying. We must get rid of it. By little and little, of course. Slowly we learn how. Learn to make our brains live with less and less body. Learn to build our bodies directly with chemicals, no longer having to stuff them full of dead roots and weeds. Learn how to reproduce ourselves without copulation. So we're getting
love,
to
life,
that.
And food all described.
Yeah.
It's all about perspective. Philostrato, the way Philostrato describes it, he uses disgusting language to describe it. Step outside and think objectively about what he's talking about, and you realize that's everything beautiful in life that he's treating with disgust.
Yeah. So all the things that we enjoy, right? When he says no longer having to stuff them full of dead brutes and weeds, i.e. eating, eating food, one of the things that human beings enjoy. Learn how to reproduce ourselves without copulation. Ew, natural sex, how gross, right? And there's actually a line later on. There will never be peace and order and discipline so long as there is sex. So it's interesting that what we have in the nice philosophy is something that turns out to be very anti-life and it turns out very anti-sex in the natural sense, right? It all has to be mediated by machines and technology and everything that is natural and biological and organic. That's the stuff that we need to clear away, right?
Right.
Let's see.
Now, do they talk at all about whether they're for liberalizing sex? I'm trying to remember if that was a part of the Bilbury element, because you could make an interesting argument that the sexual revolution and the liberalizing of sexual mores ended up having the effect of sort of taking the sexiness out of sex. Now it's just a thing you're expected to do. If you're 20 something, you're expected to sleep around, and there's no mystery or romance to it anymore. And it becomes a mechanical pleasure type of thing.
Yeah, actually, they do kind of suggest that right after this, learn how to reproduce ourselves without copulation. And then Winter says, I don't think that would be much fun, said Winter. My friend, you have already separated the fun, as you call it, from fertility. The fun itself so that does suggest that they view the liberalizing of sex, where you separate sex from the procreation, is in fact a stepping stone to this vision of life in which reproduction gets separated from the pleasures of sex entirely.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's also underscoring that a lot of people, even in the inner circle of the library, still have absolutely no clue what they're aiming towards. Now, Philostrato knows basically what they're aiming towards, but he's
really
looking at
driving
it but he's looking at it through a purely scientific lens. So we're going to find out that not even Philostrato is in on the deepest circle. There are yet deeper circles of hell that we're going to descend into.
Yes, we are. So I will tell you all that another time. The head has many sources of information. For the moment, I speak only to inspire you. I speak that you may know what can be done, what shall be done here. This institute, Dio meo, it is for something better than housing and vaccinations and faster trains and curing the people of cancer. It is for the conquest of death, or for the conquest of organic life, if you prefer. They are the same thing. It is to bring out of that cocoon of organic life which shelter the babyhood of mind, the new man, the man who will not die, the artificial man free from nature.
Yeah.
So we're getting into what are they really driving at? It's the transhumanist idea that we're going to basically put our minds into into technology, and we won't have to fear death, right, or any of the other inconveniences of biological life. Yeah.
Predicting, it's Lewis predicting people wanting to upload their brains into artificial intelligence, right? Like what, 30? We still haven't done it today, but they wouldn't start even talking about that for at least like another 10 to 20 years after Lewis wrote this. So that's Moonlight. Also in Moonlight at Bilbury, I'm sorry, we mentioned that Mr. Bultitude got mentioned earlier, but he actually appears in this chapter, just hanging out in Jane's shower. Right. And it's implied that when the director interacts with animals,
yeah.
I was going to say when the director interacts with animals, it's
and we also have
they learn to behave themselves in his house. Yeah.
Okay, I'm kind of losing you at the moment.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
All right. Did it get cut out, what I said?
A little bit, so you might have to repeat what you just said.
So what I said was that when the director interacts with animals, it's sort of like he teaches them how to behave themselves, so they're no longer like wild animals. So the reason Mr. Bultitude, the bear, can walk around the house is he's had a talk with Ransom, and so now Mr. Bultitude knows how to behave himself and not hurt anybody in the house. But he's still a big giant bear, so he'll like walk around and try to sneak out of the room, thinking he's they won't notice him, and then he'll like knock over things. There's a lot of whimsy and humor to Mr. Bultitude. It's a little kid's idea of a big friendly bear.
Yeah, right. Right.
Am I still coming through okay?
You're going in and out, it seems.
All right. I might try to hop out and hop back in real quick then and see if that helps, if you can cover for just a second.
Okay.
Okay. I'll be right back.
Okay. All right, no problem. Yeah. Just one moment here while we try to resolve our technical complaints. Yeah, it's about to get really exciting here once Marmaduke comes back, because in chapter 9, we really get to the heart of it here. Chapter 9 is entitled The Saracen's Head. So we finally get to meet the head. And that's when we realize that we're not dealing with earthly powers. Let me just put it that way. All right, Marmaduke, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah. Trying a different server, right. So it's a new profile pic.
Okay. New profile pic. All right. Okay, so we're now up to chapter 9, The Saracen's Head. So this is when Mark meets the head, right? So what do we have to say about this chapter?
We foreshadowed this previously with Hardcastle being asked to come see the head, and of course with Jane's dreams. It actually opens with Jane's dream, where she describes it and the queer smells and her perspective on it before we see the thing itself. So in nightmare form, she just sees like this face stretched out with something boiling over within it. What we learned this is this is the head of Alcazan that Philostrato believes he is artificially keeping alive through carefully maintaining the atmosphere and the blood pressure and everything. In fact, what is happening is the Saracen's head is being used to communicate orders to the real final inner circle of Bilbury. Philostrato thinks, oh, it's just an interesting little experiment. The people who are in on the job know that the Saracen's head is communicating their orders from their master, which would be the bent one, the bent Oyarsa of Earth, or Satan, depending on how you want to describe Lewis's characters. We could easily use like the biblical names to describe them. So it's either Satan or the bent Oyarsa of Thulkandra is communicating to the heads of Bilbury.
Right, and he's using the head as the head of Alcazan as the medium by which he speaks to them. Yeah, but they incorrectly believe that they have reanimated the head. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have this really grotesque, like at the center of Nice and Bilbury is this grotesque head, right, that has been quote unquote reanimated, and that is the thing that is ultimately giving orders to this organization, right?
Of note, Jane also finds it kind of romantic that Mark is, even though she's horrified, she thinks, wow, Mark's involved in some really crazy conspiracy. And she's surprised when Ransom compares what Mark is doing to Mag's husband being in jail for petty theft. Ransom doesn't think much about the romance of evil. To him, a husband making a mistake or committing theft or working for the enemy, well, those are all kind of neutrally the same things. Like he's hopeful that they'll be able to get him out of there and get him out of their clutches, but he doesn't think any higher of Mark than he does of Mr. Maggs.
Right. Let's see. So I have on page 182. Meantime, he must get up. He must do something about Jane. Apparently, he would have to bring her to Bilbury. His mind had made this decision for him at some moment he did not remember. He must get her to save his life. All his anxieties about being in the inner ring or getting a job had shrunk into insignificance. It was a question of life or death. They would kill him if he annoyed them, perhaps behead him. Oh God, if only they would really kill that monstrous little lump of torture, that lump with a face, which they kept there talking on its steel bracket. All the minor fears at Bilbury, for he knew now that all except the leaders were always afraid, were only emanations from that central fear. He must get Jane. He wasn't fighting against that now. It must be remembered, says C.S. Lewis, that in Mark's mind hardly one rag of noble thought, either Christian or pagan, had a secure lodging. His education had been neither scientific nor classical, merely modern. The severities both of abstraction and of high human tradition have passed him by, and he had neither peasant shrewdness nor aristocratic honor to help him. He was a man of straw, a glib examinee in subjects that required no exact knowledge. He had always done well in essays and general papers. And the first hint of a real threat to his bodily life knocked him sprawling. So Mark's reaction on seeing the head is, whoa, this is actually like what I've got myself into is something that it's like the heart of evil. Like he realizes that he's gotten mixed up in something incredibly evil, and he feels fear, right? That if he does anything to stand up against it, that could result in the loss of his own life, right?
And he said absolutely nothing in his education to prepare him for something like this.
Yeah. So, and Lewis points out that he's had nothing in his quote unquote modern education has prepared him to face something this elementally evil, right? And let's see. Yeah, so what else should we say here? Oh, I have this highlighted.
Hardcastle teases him about wifey, jokes about how maybe wifey's jealous because you're hanging around with me. So
yeah.
And by the way, he has enough information to know that Hardcastle is untrustworthy because he knows that it's because of Hardcastle that lying that he got kicked out, that he's going to get kicked out of the college.
Yeah.
And it's only on Hardcastle's word that he thinks that Hardcastle lies and tells him that, oh, Jane's going crazy. She has this crazy idea that I tortured her because she saw my cheroot. He knows Hardcastle's untrustworthy, but he still swallows that line and assumes that poor Jane must have imagined that someone attacked her.
We also have the thoughts of Ransom here. It was this that kept the Directful wakeful with knitted brow in the small cold hours of that morning when the others had left him. There was no doubt in his mind now that the enemy had brought Bragdon to find Merlin, and if they found him, they would reawake him. The old druid would inevitably cast his lot with the new planners. What could prevent his doing so? A junction would be effected between two kinds of power, which between them would determine the fate of our planet. Doubtless, that had been the will of the Dark Eldilla for centuries. The physical sciences, good and innocent in themselves, had already, even in Ransom's own time, begun to be warped, had been subtly maneuvered in a certain direction. Despair of objective truth had been increasingly insinuated into the scientists. Indifference to it and a concentration upon mere power had been the result. So we're seeing the observation of the shift from modernism to postmodernism. The idea that there is no such thing. There is no such thing as objective truth. There is only power, right? Babble about the elan vital and flirtations with panpsychism were bidding fair to restore the anima mundi of the magicians. Dreams of the far future destiny of man were dragging up from its shallow and unquiet grave the old dream of man as God. The very experiences of the dissecting room and the pathological laboratory were breeding a conviction. The stifling of all deep-set repugnances was the first essential for progress. And now, all this had reached a stage at which its dark contrivers thought they could safely begin to bend it back so that it would meet that other and earlier kind of power. Indeed, they were choosing the first moment at which this could have been done. You could not have done it with 19th century scientists. Their firm objective materialism would have excluded it from their minds. And even if they could have been made to believe, their inherited morality would have kept them from touching dirt. McPhee was a survivor from that tradition. It was different now. Perhaps few or none of the people of Bilbury knew what was happening. But once it happened, they would be like straw in fire. What should they find incredible, since they believed no longer in a rational universe? What should they regard as too obscene, since they held that all morality was a mere subjective byproduct of the physical and economic situations of men? So what we're saying here is the second that we embrace postmodernism and abandon the idea of an objective reality, right? That basically leaves us open to everything, including the old magic, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's horseshoe theory. It's C.S. Lewis's horseshoe theory, right? Postmodern science meets ancient magic at the ends of the horseshoes, right?
Right, but it's because their logic has pushed them to the point where they've deconstructed the modern old school style of atheism. So to an old school atheist, paganism and Christianity are both equally absurd. The postmodernist concludes that the objectivist atheist view is absurd because it assumes objective truth. Therefore, maybe there is lightning magic that the shaman can summon up, and maybe we can learn to do that. Yeah.
Let's see what else. Yeah, so it's interesting that he points out that, the Enlightenment rationalists were not susceptible to this. You had to get to the postmodernism to really be susceptible to the devil, essentially. Let's see. What else do I have?
They finally explain to Jane what Eldila are, and they give her Ransom's backstory. So she's known him as the director, or Mr. Kingfish. Now she knows that he's Ransom, and she's actually read his book, Ransom's Dialectics.
Right. I also have, continuing from that one passage I read, there was now at last a real chance for fallen man to shake off that limitation of his powers, which mercy had imposed upon him as a protection from the full results of his fall. If this succeeded, hell would be at last incarnate. Bad men, while still in the body, still crawling on this little globe, would enter that state which heretofore they had entered only after death, would have the diuturnity and power of evil spirits. Nature all over the globe of Tellus would become their slave, and of that dominion no end before the end of time itself could be certainly foreseen. That's the end of the chapter. It basically says we're now at the point where man has developed the ability to create hell on earth, right. And this is what we're facing. This is what we have to fight against. Yeah. And
some foreshadowing of this is Wither seems to be omnipresent. So earlier that was just like a creepy thing that wherever you were at Bilbury, he just seemed to be nearby. When Mark makes a run for it, he leaves Wither behind in his office, runs straight for the gate, and suddenly there's Wither again at the gate. So Wither, apparently like a ghost, has an ability to withdraw into himself and be anywhere. So, but not only is Mark perfectly aware that they're going to kill him, now Mark is perfectly aware that he actually physically can't escape there as well. He's a moral and a physical prisoner of Bilbury.
Right. So then we get to Ted, the conquered city. So what sorts of things struck you about the conquered city?
This is finally Mark's. Really, this is the only chance Mark gets to make a clean break from Bilbury. And when he gets out, he meets with Dimble. Dimble, obviously, what Dimble knows is that Mark is involved with Bilbury, and Bilbury is responsible for torturing Jane, as well as the social unrest. There have been rapes and beatings tied to the NICE police. So Dimble is genuinely furious. Mark has always been a butt kiss, so he has sensed that Dimble hasn't liked him in the past, but his solution to someone disliking him is always to kiss up or try to be nice to them, to make them like him. Dimble, on the other hand, is actually kind of aware that he's been bitter towards Mark and is actually sort of consciously been trying to be more charitable to Mark. The two of them have a conversation where they butt heads. Mark demands to know where Jane is. Dimble will not give Mark that information because he knows that the NICE will just kidnap and torture Jane some more if he does. At the same time, Dimble's trying to reach Mark and get him to come out of Bilbury and come to us for protection. Do you really want to leave Bilbury? Do you really want to leave the NICE? And Mark hesitates just a bit and says, well, how about tomorrow? Give me an hour to think at least. And Dimble has this great line: the only reason you're hesitating is so that it isn't so you can have time to think. You want time so that because you're thinking clearly right now. It's like trying to do an intervention with an alcoholic. Also, Mark's been drinking heavily this entire time, so he's literally acting like an alcoholic. But the decision, Mark makes a decision without really realizing he's made his decision. He just asks for a little bit more time to think rather than get the hell out of Bilbury when he has a chance. And that gives them just enough time to capture him and bring him back. It's also an illustration of the fact that as Mark has been made a prisoner by Bilbury, he has willingly become a servant of Bilbury's ideology. So he's fatter now. He's paler. He's more sickly. He's sarcastic, and he's pretending to be offended when he really isn't. He's playing the part of the offended husband who's going to give his wife a stern talking to as a way of maybe like making himself feel a little bit like a man. Again, they've made him feel like he's completely unmanned at work. So maybe he can take it out on Dimble and Jane to make himself feel a little better about themselves. And he has like this gripping moment where for the first time in his life, he sees himself as a man like Dimble must see him. He takes a look at himself and he realizes that I'm like a little rat, sneaky little rat of a man.
Yeah, or a spaniel. They
Yeah.
Yeah, we have this from page 215. For Mark liked to be liked. A snub sent him away dreaming of not revenge, but of brilliant jokes or achievements which would one day conquer the goodwill of the man who had snubbed him. If he were ever cruel, it would be downwards to inferiors and outsiders who solicited his regard, not upwards to those who rejected it. There was a good deal of the spaniel in him. So he's this sneaky little obedient spaniel, right? Who's basically kowtowing to people who are above him in the social hierarchy, and the implication, and mistreating people who are downwards of him. Like the, little kiss, you said kiss butt, right?
Yeah.
The kiss butt, brown nosing. Yeah. And he comes to see himself the way other people would see him. Right.
And Dimble makes a really important distinction here where he says, either you didn't know they tortured Jane, in which case you have no power to do anything to stop Bilbury, or you did know they tortured Jane, and you do have the power to shape their policy. In neither case will I reveal to you where she is. It almost doesn't matter if you're ignorant or knowingly evil. Once you're participating in evil, you are on the side of evil. Your actions have evil consequences. Therefore, you must be treated like an enemy. Yeah. Yep, I can't trust you. Yeah. Even as I'm offering you the olive branch to get out of there and become and essentially come over to our side for our protection, right? Like, even as I'm willing to grant you a sanctuary from the enemy, I can't forget that you are working for the enemy currently.
Yeah.
Dimble shows a very strong sense of manly, intelligent courage here, in contrast to Mark's weakness.
Right. So I have on page 217, Dimble asking him, have you the means to bring her to book? He said, are you already as near the center of Bilbury as that? If so, then you have consented to the murder of Hingis, the murder of Compton. If so, it was by your orders that Mary Prescott was raped and battered to death in the sheds behind the station. It is with your approval that criminals, honest criminals whose hands you are unfit to touch, are being taken from the jails to which British judges sent them on the conviction of British juries and packed off to Bilbury to undergo for an indefinite period, out of reach of the law, whatever tortures and assaults on personal identity you call remedial treatment. It is you who have driven 2,000 families from their homes to die of exposure in every ditch from here to Birmingham or Worcester. It is you who can tell us why Place and Raleigh and Cunningham, at 80 years of age, have been arrested and where they are. And if you are as deeply in it as that, not only will I not deliver Jane into your hands, but I would not deliver my dog.
Yeah.
And Mark's like, really, really, said Mark, this is absurd. I know one or two high-handed things have been done. You always get some of the wrong sort in a police force, especially at first. But, I mean to say, what have I ever done that you should make me responsible for every action that any Nice official has taken or is said to have taken? Gutter press, thundered Dimble, who seemed to Mark to be even physically larger than he was a few minutes before. What nonsense is this? Do you suppose I don't know that you have control of every paper in the country except one, and that one has not appeared this morning? Its printers have gone on strike. The poor dupes say they will not print articles attacking the People Institute. Where the lies in all other papers come from, you know better than I. It may seem strange to say that Mark, having long lived in a world without charity, had nevertheless very seldom met real anger. Malice and plenty he had encountered, but it all operated by snubs and sneers and stabbing in the back. The forehead and eyes and voice of this elderly man had an effect on him which was stifling and unnerving. At Bilbury, one used the words whining and yapping to describe any opposition which the actions of Bilbury aroused in the outer world. And Mark had never had enough imagination to realize what the whining would really be like if you met it face to face. So this
which is continuing a theme. Mark decides all of these policies and writes all of these essays and articles about people he doesn't know and hasn't met. and he's shocked when he encounters it in his real life.
And he realizes that the so-called whining is in fact genuine righteous anger for what these people are doing, right?
Yep.
And it knocks him flat to actually encounter the consequences of what he has been cooperating with, right? And he's resisting taking responsibility for this too. He says, "I tell you, I knew nothing about it," he shouted. "Damn it, I'm the injured party. The way you talk, anyone would think it was your wife who'd been ill-treated. So it might have been, so it may be. It may be any man or woman in England. It was a woman and a citizen. What does it matter whose wife it was? But I tell you, I'll raise hell about it. I'll break the infernal bitch who did it, if it means breaking the whole nice." Dimble said nothing. Mark knew that Dimble knew he was talking nonsense. Yet Mark could not stop. If he did not bluster, he would not know what to say. So we have this defensive, right? As soon as he encounters this righteous anger, he gets defensive and says,
"Yep,
no, it wasn't me. I'm not responsible for this. Why are you pointing all the finger at me? Why are you pointing your finger at me?" Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a really amazing conversation. Dimble saying, "Do you suppose I don't know that you have control of every paper in the country except one?" Boy, do I feel that relevance with our modern day context. The fact that there is a particular party that seems to be in control of much of the press, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's happening in a way in which many people are acting corrupt. They believe in their own self-interest without knowing what it is they're contributing to. So there are so many people who are just sort of cluelessly following what they think are their own interests or their own ideology, but collectively they're all creating a system that can perpetuate extreme evil while making excuses for it, lying about its existence, or defending it if anyone actually points out its existence. It's like the cathedral in kind of like postmodern theory, where every part of the cathedral supports every other part of the cathedral. That's what Bilbury has become. It's a cathedral for postmodern, hyper scientific, inhuman forces.
Yeah. And so we get to here on page 219. "I see you don't trust me," said Mark, instinctively summoning to his face the manly and injured expression which had often served him well in headmaster studies. Dimble was a truthful man. "No," he said after a longish pause, "I don't quite." Mark shrugged his shoulders and turned away. "Suddock," said Dimble, "this is not a time for foolery or compliments. It may be that both of us are within a few minutes of death. You have probably been shadowed into the college, and I, at any rate, don't propose to die with polite insincerities in my mouth. I don't trust you. Why should I? You are, at least in some degree, the accomplice of the worst men in the world. Your very coming to me this afternoon may be only a trap." "Don't you know me better than that?" said Mark. "Stop talking nonsense," said Dimble. "Stop posturing and acting, if only for a minute. Who are you to talk like that? They have corrupted better men than you or me before now. Strake was a good man once. Philostrata was at least a great genius. Even Alcasan, yes, I know who your head is, was at least a plain murderer, something better than they have now made of him. Who are you to be except?" Mark gaped. The discovery of how much Dimble knew had suddenly inverted his whole picture of the situation. No logic was left in him. And then we get to, on 220, Dimble saying to him, "There is no time." When he says you have to leave, and Mark says, "I need to think that over," Dimble says, "There is no time," said Dimble, "and there is really nothing to think about. I'm offering you a way back into the human family, but you must come at once. It's a question of affecting my whole future career." "Your career," said Dimble. "It's a question of damnation or a last chance, but you must come at once." So we have Mark dithering and resisting and being hesitant to make the right choice. And Dimble is saying to him, now, you must choose now. You must choose the side of good. And there's nothing to think about. your career doesn't matter. It's all about what is the right thing to do, right?
Right. Mark's tried anger, he's tried lying, he's tried bargaining. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is no security for anyone now. The battle has started. I'm offering you a place on the right side, right? And you have to choose, right? And then we have, he wanted to be perfectly safe and yet also very nonchalant and daring, to be admired for manly honesty among the Dimbles, and yet also for realism and knowingness at Bilbury, to have 2 more large whiskeys, and also to think everything out very clearly and collectedly. And it was beginning to rain, and his head had begun to ache again. Damn the whole thing. Damn. Why had he such a rotten heredity? Why had his education been so ineffective? Why was the system of society so irrational? Why was his luck so bad? So
anyone's fault but mine. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is him. Now that he's been faced with this choice, he's cursing his lack of luck, right? Meanwhile, after this, Dimble drives to St. Anne's, and he's thinking along the way that, was I too self-righteous, right? So Dimble has the ability to question his own motives and his own like how he presented himself, right? Was I too self-righteous? Have I sinned in this scenario, right? So he has the ability to examine himself in a way that Mark does not, that Mark still has to develop, right? All right, what else about this chapter should we discuss?
I think, isn't this the chapter where Hardcastle makes the comment that she only had 2 people to tail and 3 people she wanted tailed. So she decided, well, Dimble seems to be the less politically connected and famous of the 3 guys. So I'll have my cops tail these other 2 Christian guys who are important people in politics or important scholars, because I think they're more dangerous. But ironically, Dimble, the person that Hardcastle thinks is the least impressive and the least dangerous of the 3 Christians, is actually the one who's part of the director's organization. So in that sense, he's the most dangerous. Bilbury underestimates people outside of Bilbury because it looks at people through the Bilbury lens, and the Bilbury lens is power and impressiveness and political knowingness. Outside of Bilbury, human qualities tend to be actually a lot more important.
Right. Let's see. Okay, so then we get to chapter 11, the battle begun.
So Jane, they're going to go and try to find Merlin's body, acting on Jane's vision, which reveals to them they might be able to sneak underneath.
Right. Yeah, so the change from the road to the field was as if one had passed from a waking into a phantasmal world. Everything became darker, wetter, more incalculable. Each small descent felt as if you might be coming to the edge of a precipice. They were following a track beside a hedge. Wet and prickly tentacles seemed to snatch at them as they went. So they're going from the road. I think I highlighted this because they're going from the road to the realm of myth, essentially. So this description here kind of gets you into that place. We're now going from the part that is controlled and civilized into the part that is dangerous and mythical and uncivilized, right? And on the same page, they realized that they had not really believed in Merlin till now. They had thought they were believing in the director in the kitchen, but they had been mistaken. The shock was still to take. Out here, with only the changing red light ahead and the black all around, one really began to accept this fact. This tryst was something dead, and yet not dead, something dug up, exhumed from that dark pit of history which lies between the ancient Romans and the beginning of the English. The Dark Ages, thought Dimble. How lightly one had read and written those worlds. but now they were going to step right into that darkness. It was an age, not a man, that awaited them in the horrible little dingle. So we have this description as they're searching for Merlin, right? That we have this description that describes them in the search for Merlin. They are in essence stepping into the dark ages of the past, right?
And for Dimble, who's a scholar, he's read and written about this stuff all his life, but he's meeting it.
Yeah.
For the first time. There's actually kind of a neat parallel where Mark writes and thinks about people he doesn't have any experience of. Dimble writes and thinks about the Dark Ages, which is in the past, so he hasn't been able to experience it. Now, for the first time in his life, it's becoming a real thing to him. And that realness is different than the head knowledge of its existence. You can write and know all sorts of things, but to live them is to like never forget it. Right.
So it's one thing to have kind of an intellectual knowledge of something, and another thing entirely to actually experience it. So they're having this experience where they're actually having contact with this more ancient age. I also have this passage on 231. Jane's thoughts. She did not doubt that the Eldilla existed, nor did she doubt the existence of the stronger and more obscure being whom they obeyed, whom the director obeyed, and through him the whole household, even McPhee. If it had ever occurred to her to question whether all these things might be the reality behind what she had been taught at school as religion, she had put the thought aside. The distance between these alarming and operative realities and the memory of, say, of fat Mrs. Dimble saying her prayers was too wide. The things belonged for her to different worlds. On the one hand, terror of dreams, rapture of obedience, the tingling light and sound from under the director's door, and the great struggle against an imminent danger. On the other, the smell of pews, horrible lithographs of the Savior, apparently 7 feet high with the face of a consumptive girl, the embarrassment of confirmation classes, the nervous affability of clergymen. But this time, if it was really to be death, the thought would not be put aside, because really, it now appeared that almost anything might be true. The world had already turned out to be so very unlike what she had expected. The old ring fence had been smashed completely. One might be in for anything. Maladil might be, quite simply and crudely, God. There might be a life after death, a heaven, a hell. The thought glowed in her mind for a second like a spark that had fallen on shavings. And then a second later, like those shavings, her whole mind was in a blaze, and with just enough left outside the blaze to utter some kind of protest. But this is unbearable. I ought to have been told. So it's her coming to the realization that that there is a connection between what she's been experiencing, and that religion that she learned at school that she really. What's interesting about this passage is that religion, as it is practiced in England, is contrasted with the real religion, right? Mm-hmm. That the religion that Jane knows is the kind of institutionalized, stultified religion that, in some sense, has been separated from the actual reality that once established it, right?
Yeah, and for her, being a knowing intellectual was her escape out of Christianity, right? And yet, as she's rediscovering it, there are ways that Christianity is speaking to her knowing, enlightened atheism that are traditionally the kind of things that she would like to use as arguments against Christianity. She wants to feel like more egalitarian than Christianity. The Christian household is functionally egalitarian, even if it's philosophically opposed to modernist egalitarian ideas. Right. She thinks of herself as maybe like more charitable and appreciative of democratic principles. The Christian household demonstrates that. It's a difference between thought and action. And there's this really weird line after that quote where they say, "Look out, Jane," said Denniston. "That's a tree." I think it's a cow," said Jane. It almost after like this really incisive look inside of Jane's abstract mind, there's this just really blunt statement that she looks at a tree and thinks it's a cow. I think that's almost like a comedic way of underscoring the point that Jane isn't sure what she sees. And if you're not sure what you see, that interrupts your ability to be able to understand it, because you can't really trust your eyes.
Right. The other thing to comment on in this chapter is, so at the end of the last chapter, Mark was arrested for the murder of Hengist. And that's where the lost wallet comes in. We said before, he lost his wallet, ding, 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 right? Well, the reason is that his wallet was planted at the scene of the murder of Hengist so that he could be framed for that murder if necessary to get him to heal, right? So now that he is starting to feel doubt about Bilbury's mission, right, and has tried to escape, now they finally spring that trap. So now he has been imprisoned by Nice, right, and basically forced to reflect upon his life so far, right? So I have this passage from page 242. And then after months and months, it had happened. He had a picture of himself, the odious little outsider who wanted to be an insider, the infantile gull, drinking in the husky and unimportant confidences as if he were being admitted to the government of the planet. Was there no beginning to his folly? Had he been the utter fool all through from the very day of his birth? Even as a schoolboy, when he had ruined his work and half broken his heart trying to get into the society called Grip, and lost his only real friend in doing so. Even as a child, fighting Myrtle because she would go and talk secrets with Pamela next door. So he starts to actually see himself as he really is in all of his faults. The fact that he's been a toady and a kiss butt and a suck up all of his life, and that has caused him to make decisions that are in fact odious and immoral, right?
Every single thing that he's wanted in life, he's realized is empty and a lie.
Right.
He's never been forced into a position where he's had to think too much about what he's doing, because he knew if he started to think about it too much, then it could unravel. Now that he's trapped in near the end, there's no harm in ripping apart the spider's web now. And he realizes that once you lose that overarching goal, every decision made towards reaching that goal is destroyed. It becomes worthless, because what you were looking for was worthless. Also, we haven't talked about Frost too much. Frost, we've seen him kind of around. Mark just had the impression that he was a bit of a cold fish and a bit of a quiet type of guy. Frost starts making more of an impression now, and we see that Frost is the exact opposite of Wither in some ways. Wither talks around the point. Frost doesn't like to say a word that isn't absolutely relevant, and he completely wants to strip out any emotional or distracting language. Wither and Fairy Hardcastle are wondering about how are we going to break Mark. There's a debate about using torture or deception, and Frost proposes that he could either be deceived, or he could be they could persuade him to really truly join the inner circle by explaining to him exactly what it is that they're after. And if Mark accepts and becomes part of them, then he'll help them get Jane, because he wants to get Jane too, and make Jane submit to their program. So that's the gamble. They actually haven't counted on the fact that if Mark is in fear of death, that could force him to kind of like think through things and maybe change his perspective a little bit. So Frost is about to become a much more important antagonist in Mark's life, because Frost is now going to present him with the argument for why you should join the true inner ring of the Institute. Everything Mark wanted to be part of that inner ring, Frost is going to offer him the true inner ring of being part of the group that will rule over all humanity, escape death, and ultimately one man will be made into an immortal god that has dominion over all of nature.
Yeah. So we have these long passages where Mark is really seeing his life for the first time, and as you said, realizing that everything that he had been working toward was worthless, right? So that he has basically wasted his life up to this point trying to be the kiss butt, trying to be the toady, right? and has not, and now he needs to reassess and figure out, where do I go from here? Now that that goal that I had in my head has been completely destroyed, how do I rewrite my life, essentially, at this point?
And Jane is very important to Mark's picture of what the good is. Earlier, right. Jane had an epiphany where she realized Mark was unlucky to marry me. I've been a bad wife. I should make an effort to be a better wife. Mark has an epiphany that Jane was misfortunate to marry me. I'm an unmanned man. Maybe I could be the hero. Maybe I could be the hero fighting on the front lines for Jane. He finally has a mental picture of himself as a hero on his wife's behalf.
Yeah. So page 244. And now he knew for the first time what he had secretly meant to do with Jane. If all had succeeded, if he had become the sort of man he hoped to be, she was to have been the great hostess, the secret hostess, in the sense that only the very esoteric few would know who that striking-looking woman was and why it mattered so enormously to secure her goodwill. Well, it was lucky for Jane. She seemed to him, as he now thought of her, to have in herself deep wells and knee-deep meadows of happiness, rivers of freshness, enchanted gardens of leisure, where he could not enter but could have spoiled. She was one of those other people, like Pearson, like Denniston, like the Dimbles, who could enjoy things for their own sake. She was not like him. It was well that she should be rid of him. So so earlier we had Jane realizing that she was not giving Mark her all. And then here we have the parallel realization that I have not been serving Jane, that I have been seeing Jane basically as a trophy, that once I become successful, she will be my trophy beside me, right? Mm-hmm. And so he comes to the parallel realization that, maybe it is best that she should be rid of me, just as Jane was thinking maybe it would be best if Mark would be rid of me, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So, and then at that moment came the sound of the key. So this is where this is Frost, right? Coming in.
Yep.
And so then in the later chapters, we're going to see more of Frost trying to influence Mark to really embrace the philosophy of the nice, right? So that's what a lot of my quotes from here come from. All right, so we have chapter 12, Wet and Windy Night. What are some of the things that you would like to discuss from this chapter?
Jane and the gang miss Merlin. They see an old tramp hanging out by himself, but they seemingly fail in their mission to capture Merlin, to prevent Bilbury from getting him. We get a little bit more insight into like the internal mind of Withers. I don't think they talk about Frost's mentality quite yet, but there's a parallel and a contrast between Withers and Frost. Both of them hate reality for different reasons. Yes. Withers hates reality because he has like aesthetic problems with the world and with truth. Like if you hate the world around you, then one solution would be to withdraw into yourself. So one of the reasons Withers is always, talking in circles and not giving anybody a straight answer is because he's trying to retreat into himself as a way of keeping the world away from him and keeping truth away from him. He's almost like a Zen Buddhist monk who's denying the reality of his own body to the point he withers away and becomes like a skeletal type of mystic. Frost also hates reality, but in a completely different way. He hates the idea that the chemistry in the brain creates this illusion of the mind. So he thinks the mind and emotions are illusions. Therefore, what must be done is you have to look at those purely as emotions and function on the basis of pure objectivity. So the reason why he's kind of like a stuffed suit, and there's even like little descriptions like he walks in with his hands held down straight by his sides. He's a little gray ramrod machine man who will only talk in pure logical categories and pure no bullshit, right? So he doesn't lie to Mark in the same way that Withers might lie to Mark. But
right.
because he believes that emotions and the human mind have no reality, to him, that means objectivity is a denial of everything other than the objective faculty. Ironically, Withers and Frost end up in the same place. The mind all by itself, without anybody else or anything else interfering with you. They just have taken different paths to that same hellish destination, and there's pushback between them because they hate the way the other person talks. Frost hates how Withers is always beating around the bush, and Withers hates how Frost is always brief and to the point. Yet they're both pushing essentially to the end of destroying everything because they hate themselves and they hate the world around them. It's like suicide and destruction pushed to a final degree.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to make note that before Frost has his conversation with Mark goes into the conversation with an absolute resolution that I'm not going to listen to a thing this guy says. I'm not going to believe a thing this guy says. Yet, in the conversation itself, Mark feels his resolve, not just being tempted, but really falling away in a way. And he starts to feel a desire that's greater than lust. And there's this very memorable description of this kind of desire. And Lewis says, calling it lust, it's helpful to someone who's experienced it, but someone who hasn't experienced it can't truly understand it. You can only kind of understand it from an outside perspective. The desire Mark feels is the desire to possess Jane, not sexually as his wife, but to possess her as a way of like making her a part of his desire or his world. You mentioned earlier having her as a trophy, having her as a tool in Mark's game of making himself like a king who's at the center of the world. He feels that desire so powerfully that he realizes, wait a second, my desires themselves can change regardless of whether I resolve to do something. He kind of naively believes that he's a materialist, but he naively believes that he has free will. And suddenly he's struck that, well, wait a second, even my will itself is something that can be assaulted or taken out of my control. So how is this fair? Shouldn't the universe give a guy a break if he wants to be good? He has no religious language to describe God. That's the closest he has.
Yeah, so I have on 266. It was unfair. He was a man trying for the first time in his life to do what was obviously the right thing. The thing that Jane and the Dimbles and Aunt Gilly would have approved of. You might have expected that when a man behaved in that way, the universe would back him up. For the relics of some semi-savage versions of theism, as Mark had picked up in the course of his life, were stronger in him than he knew. And he felt, though he would not have put it into words, that it was up to the universe to reward his good resolutions. Yet the very first moment you tried to be good, the universe let you down. It revealed gaps you had never dreamed of. It invented new laws for the express purpose of letting you down. That was what you got for your pains. Yeah. So it's like, it's not fair. I'm trying to be good, and things are now becoming more difficult, right?
Right.
But that is in fact how being good works, right? Once you make the resolution to obey God and to be good, then that doesn't actually. That's what's so wrong with things like the prosperity gospel. The idea that if you follow God, everything will suddenly fall into place and all will be good for you. All will be good and you will know success. That's actually the opposite of what happens, because once you decide to obey God and to be good, then you start to become more conscious of all of the things that are wrong in your life and all of the things that are wrong inside of your own soul. So it actually becomes more difficult for you because now you are conscious of things that you were just kind of passing by in your life and ignoring, right?
Exactly. There are fights that you're not even aware are taking place within yourself. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So then we get to chapter 13. They have pulled down deep heaven on their heads.
This is where we get the first two books are really helpful for this part.
Yeah, for understanding this. Yeah. So we have We have the description here of the moon, right?
Right.
Selva is she who mortals call the moon. She walks in the lowest sphere. The rim of the world that was wasted goes through her. Half of her orb is turned towards us and shares our curse. Her other half looks to deep heaven. Happy would he be who could cross that frontier and see the fields on our further side. On this side, the womb is barren and the marriage is cold. There dwell an accursed people full of pride and lust. There, when a young man takes a maiden in marriage, they do not lie together, but each lies with a cunningly fashioned image of the other, made to move and to be warmed by devilish arts. For real flesh will not please them. They are so dainty, delicati, in their dreams of lust. Their real children they fabricate by vile arts in a secret place. So you mentioned before that the moon is the place. Yeah. So this is where it actually gets explicitly described that they don't even have sex with each other. They have sex with sex bots, basically. Right.
But through a medieval perspective, he's describing it the way a medieval person would describe it. So there's this contrast between Philostrato has this scientific, that's so interesting how they do that up on the moon, and whereas Ransom has acquired this either through his communication with the Eldil or through his study of Arthurian legends. So there's this idea that the ancients knew all this about the cosmos, and we somehow lost connection with that ancient knowledge about the kind of like the grand reality of the universe. It should be mentioned here that Ransom is talking with Merlin. So the fact that Ransom has been to other planets gives him knowledge that persuades Merlin that he is the true Pendragon. And Merlin is not a modern man. He doesn't think or talk or behave like a modern man. He behaves and thinks like a 5th century man, which makes him an unusual presence. Yeah, and he says a lot of strange things, but he finds our world strange at the same time.
So we've all been imagining that because he came back in the 20th century, he'd be a 20th century man. Time is more important than we thought. The past is basically a foreign country, as a lot of people I talk to say. Even the past in our own culture will be a foreign country to us if we were to ever visit it.
Ransom explains that because Bilbury explored space, that violated a law of war. So because Earth, Thulkandra, the silent planet, is supposed to be under siege, it means that the other Oyarsa aren't supposed to come here, and the Eldil of our planet are supposed to stay trapped on this planet. But what's happened is, since they invaded the other planets, that's like an act of war. Therefore, it's become possible for
now we can come.
Now that they can come, but they need a vehicle.
So we have that. We have another description here on 282. Merlin is the reverse of Bilbury. He's at the opposite extreme. He is the last vestige of an old order in which matter and spirit were, from our modern point of view, confused. For him, every operation on nature is a kind of personal contact, like coaxing a child or stroking one's horse. After him came the modern man, to whom nature is something dead, a machine to be worked and taken to bits if it won't work the way he pleases. Finally come the Bilbury people, who take over that view from the modern man unaltered and simply want to increase their power by tacking onto it the aid of spirits, extra-natural, anti-natural spirits. Of course they hoped to have it both ways. They thought the old magia of Merlin, which worked in with the spiritual qualities of nature, loving and reverencing them and knowing them from within, could be combined with the new Goetia, the brutal surgery from without. No, in a sense, Merlin represents what we've got to get back to in some different way. So Merlin here is described as something ancient that existed before modernity, right?
He's a pagan Christian.
He's a pagan Christian.
For the modern Christians, they don't endorse Merlin consulting with spirits, but the reason Merlin consulted with spirits is because he loves nature, and he probably didn't quite understand in his age what the nature of spiritual reality was. And in some ways, maybe the nature of spiritual reality changes over time. So they have this idea of, Dimble has this idea that everything's getting sharper and more clearly divided. So if you lived in Merlin's age, you could wander around and meet the fairies, and who knows what the fairies are supposed to be. Then as you move into our age, they settle into camps, and it becomes more obvious to you what the difference between an angel and a demon is. You can't possibly be confused about which one you're encountering.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, at this point, we're at 2 hours and 45 minutes, and
wow.
I think I'm going to have to sign off for the night so that I may have dinner.
All right.
So what we may have to do is we may have to do a part 2 on this because there's still about 100. Yeah, there's still about 100 pages of the book to go. So that's what we'll do. On August 7th, we will have a part 2 of this stream where we will continue to talk about the back half of the book, which is I'm very excited for some of the stuff that we're going to come up to. For example, the Descent of the Planets is a very interesting passage that we can go over in detail. We also have Mark in the objective room, which is basically...
I want to talk about that because of the aesthetics of it.
Yeah. The objective room is so that has some very interesting things to say about our reaction to art and reality and so on. So that's some of the stuff that we're going to cover in part 2. Any final words before we sign off for the night?
I said this is one of the weirdest, scariest adventure, demonic sci-fi Christian books that has ever been written. And
yes.
If we haven't convinced you yet to read this, I don't know why wouldn't you read the absolute weirdest, coolest dystopian book ever written? That's my closing thought for part 1, and we'll get into more in part 2.
Yeah. So stay tuned. Please come back on August 7th, same time for part 2, in which we will talk about some of the things that we suggested are on the way. And thank you to everyone who stopped by. And for those of you who are going to be listening to this asynchronously at a later time or date, thank you for listening. And I hope to see you on the 7th. And I also hope that some of you, if you have the time on Tuesday night, 8:00 Eastern, I'm going to be doing my birthday stream, Ask Me Anything stream. If you have time to stop by then, I would love to see you there as well. And one other thing, down in the description of this video, I have the link to Number One Marmaduke Fans channel. And I also have a link to my Buy Me a Coffee. If you would like to buy me a book and support me for these streams that I'm doing, then please click on that link and send me a little bit of support. It'd be very much appreciated. Thank you once again, and signing off for tonight.